Hi, and welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'm going to be going over my August wrap-up. I mentioned in my TBR that this may or may not be the first book that I read for the month. And it turns out it was the first book that I read for the month. Not a great start for the month. The first thing I noticed right off the bat was how flowery the narrative was. Just over the top metaphors and similes and imagery. It just too much. Way too much. And then I started picking up on some tones in the description that rubbed me the wrong way. One of the things I noticed was that she's extremely, not chauvinistic, not misogynistic, but her characters sure paid attention to women's body parts a lot. Too much, in my opinion. Like one description of the supposedly upstanding police chief, it's like, he's looking at this woman, and of course all the women are falling after him because he's the irresistibly attractive. But whatever. He describes her jiggling bosom. I'm like, really? Bosom? Bosom? But the statement that caught me off guard was a statement by one of the characters who we see a portion of the narrative through her perspective, Liz. She's making an observation upon her first meeting of one of the other characters, Tia, the one that I mentioned before, the love interest, and saying something like she'd never really cared for exotic looking women. What? Not only is that sexist, but that's racist. Like, what on earth? And on top of that, there was no need. There was absolutely no need for that comment. None. None whatsoever. That was about a quarter of the way through, and I really considered just putting it down and not reading it. I have a hard time DNFing, and with a book this short, I'm like, oh, I'll just go ahead and finish it. But it really puts me off Heitzman as an author. Additionally, the shifts between the perspectives, there were far too many. Within the first couple chapters, you shift from Jonah to Tia to Liz. Actually, you shift from Jonah to Piper, who is Tia's roommate, to Tia to Liz. Far too much. And I saw the answer coming a mile away. I feel even more heated. Let me just get into this. So today, just about an hour or so ago, I finished this book by the same author as Indivisible, The Breath of Dawn. I closed this book and said, I'm done with Christian fiction. That sums up basically what I feel about this. So, in no particular order, here's what I have to say about this. One, it's too long. This story, Heitzman could have told in 200 pages, not 430 or 428. Number two, the scenarios were entirely too far-fetched. The badness of the bad guy didn't even make sense. Three, the actions that Morgan, the protagonist, takes also don't make sense. Like, he suggests, because she, out of the blue, after knowing him for a few weeks, asks for a fake ID, because he's rich and can do anything. He suggests, why don't you marry me? I'm sorry, what? When, if he has all that money, he could just help her pay for a legal name change. If you wanted to do that. Didn't have to do marriage to get that. It made me gag a lot. It's so far-fetched. Yeah, it's not worth it. And the quality, like structurally, the narrative is sound. Heitzman has skill in her narrative. And she uses it like this. She has writing skill, but turns out utter rubbish. So after the first two books I read this month, I needed a palate cleanse. I shifted to nonfiction and chose On My Own, a memoir by Eleanor Roosevelt. Wow, this is exactly what I needed. I started it right before I went to bed, and her prose felt almost like a comforting blanket. It's hard to describe, but it flowed well. And it painted a picture of a really awesome woman. And then as I read more, I got into how much of an incredible woman she was. She had such a brilliant mind. I also loved seeing the different aspects of her life. She came from basically American quote-unquote royalty, you know, rich, upper class. And so there were some of those things that made their way through the narrative. And then it gets into her work with the United Nations and the Human Rights Commission. She's constantly self-deprecating, and you can't help but smile because she did such a great job. And it's just, this is exactly what I needed, and this is definitely getting 5 stars and definitely going on my wish list. So for book 4 this month, we continue the nonfiction trend and the really good book trend, and I picked up Becoming Justice Blackman. I first put this book on my to-read list back when I was getting my master's and was taking constitutional history. And I was just filling up my to-read list with things about the Supreme Court, constitutional history, things like that. When I picked this up, I thought the concept sounded intriguing. So the author, Linda Greenhouse, she crafted this narrative using Justice Blackman's own writings. And she even talked about how difficult it was to interpret his handwriting sometimes. Love that authenticity. And so it's not a traditional biography in which she consulted all sorts of secondary sources and the primary sources, but this narrative comes off, it's different than a memoir, which is the first person, that person themselves writing it, because they're shaping the narrative as they're doing it. It's a telling of a person's life using their own words, but they're not the ones shaping it. And I absolutely loved it. The next book we have is Pinned by Sharon Flake. I really looked forward to reading this because I thought the concept sounded intriguing. When I first started reading it, I thought, oh, good. It's at least starting to meet my expectations. Can't make a total judgment call on it until I finish it. I loved how so let me back up. The narrative alternates every other chapter between Autumn and Adonis. Sharon Flake created a unique voice for both of the characters and told the story in these alternating chapters, and I thought she captured the voice so well. It felt like the narrative literally flowed out of the heads of the characters, and even though this wasn't first person, we were really seeing life as they saw it. Unfortunately, the character development, it didn't really happen. The only character who really developed at all, and only towards the later stages, was Autumn. She did show growth. She did show that she wanted to overcome her problem. Adonis, on the other hand, I grew frustrated with him quite quickly. He felt like a jerk for most of the time, and I wanted to tell Autumn, you're better off with someone else. I really do like her as a character, and I love the way that Flake portrayed her difficulties and the realities and her parents trying to help her. It was good, but not great. So the next book I read on ebook, and it was actually the last of the SCASL books, and it's called When I Was Summer. In this book, the main character, Nora, she's always known that she's adopted, and that hasn't really mattered, but there are some times where she feels like she doesn't quite fit with her family. And she absolutely loves music, is an amazing bass player, is in a band. They get an opportunity to play at this amazing venue in, I believe, San Francisco, and they're in the LA area. They have this opportunity, but her parents are forcing her to do this internship with some sort of environmental organization. She doesn't want to do it. And she also has a major crush on the lead vocalist, who has an on and off again girlfriend, and they break up right before they go on this road trip, but she also finds out from her sister her original name before she was adopted, because she was adopted at 18 months. And her original name was Summer, and she finds out her parents' name, and all of a sudden she wants to find them. So this trip to go play at this place becomes a search for her birth parents. Again, I have the problems with the character development. These characters seem well started, but only one of them, only Nora, develops at all, and only towards the end. Daniel, the lead vocalist, is abhorrent. I do not like him at all. And also there are some logical, like logistical flaws. Like there's flying on airplanes, and Nora is not 18. She's only 17. A minor cannot buy a ticket by themselves. I know this, you know, and yet she gets multiples without telling people. Doesn't make any sense. So there was stuff there, so I give it a 3-star, but the execution of some things were not so great. Next we have Game Changer, also by Margaret Peterson Haddix. I mentioned in my TBR video that Neil Shusterman also had a book that came out this year with the same name, similar premise. If you go to my Goodreads review, which I'll link in the description, even though I didn't like that book as much, I liked it better than this one. Now, this one, similar premise. Something happens at the beginning to flip things for KT. To start off, the incident that flipped things and put her in that alternative universe didn't really make sense at first. Even when it got explained at the end, I still went, really? I don't 100% get it. I got it, but it wasn't executed well. Then you have how almost all of the adults respond to the kids in this book, and it just doesn't strike me as realistic, especially in the alternate universe. I didn't like this one. Next, we have 6 Days of War. This book took me a lot longer to finish than I planned, but not because of the book itself. For some reason, I got super sleepy whenever I read this book, and I knew it wasn't because of the book itself, so it took me several days to get this book done. Oren speaks from a place of expertise. He pulled a lot of information into this. This book describes, I mean, most of the book is describing 6 24-hour days. Obviously, that's how many hours are in a day. And it's fascinating how things, all the dominoes fell and what happened and how this war affects life in the Middle East even today. Now, I will say military history is not my favorite, so I did enjoy the pre-war narrative and the post-war narrative a little bit more than the intricate battle portions of it, but still a really good book. Next on the wrap-up, we have Claim to Fame by Margaret Peterson Haddix. I will admit not being super intrigued with the concept. That just seemed like a child star having a breakdown, becoming agoraphobic. But then I get into this book and it hit me a few different ways. I didn't end up super liking it, but that's mainly because at the beginning, and it gets explained what her talent or gift or whatever she calls it is, but you don't know what it is at first. And so the kidnapping scene that's set up at the beginning, it feels so weird. You don't know what's going on and you don't know how the main character is reacting or why. Well, you know how she's reacting, but you don't know why. And I should have known that Haddix would have some sort of supernatural element to this. Not supernatural as in heavenly beings, but just some bit of fantastical element that's just slightly beyond what we normally believe, but could be possible. And I think that because at the beginning I just didn't connect with the character, that it ended up falling flat for me. Next we have Safekeeping. I went into this book really intrigued by the setup. It was potential dystopian, but not a full dystopian, like this is the beginnings of the government falling apart. But the problem is Karen Hess, the author, she never really explains what caused this, what went into this, why did so many things fall apart, and then how on earth do they get resolved? And seeing what we did at the beginning of this year and seeing how the various levels of our government, our federal system, and then the state actors and the federal employees on the state level, how that all worked together to prevent catastrophe made this unbelievable for me. The writing is beautiful. The characters, I think, Hess did a great job with them. But the overall premise fell flat. So I did like this one better than Claim to Fame, which I read right before this. Next we have Push Out. And this is one of the books that I said that I read a few pages a day. And so I had started and was about a third of the way through at the beginning of this month. I think that the author did a phenomenal job in highlighting this significant problem that we have in the education system. And she did so in a way that I found extremely valuable. She did it by letting these girls speak. She put their words into this narrative, and their words become such powerful forces in like taking somebody by the collar and waking them and saying, see, look what you're doing. Next we get to Stowaway, the last of the Karen Hess books I think I have on my to-read list. I thought might be an intriguing concept because based on a real person that Hess did her historical research and built out their life, and it was told in a diary format, which I have gotten soured on after reading a bunch of the Diary of America books, because so many of those authors say it's a diary format but then tell a narrative. But Hess sticks to an actual diary format and even formats it almost like these daily entries like they would back then. But towards the middle of this book, it really started to drag, and I had a hard time putting any energy into it. And I think that's just because the actual historical events itself, there was a lull in what was happening on the ship. But I think she did a good job. I think this is a good example of what this format can and should be. I would rate it 3 stars, so not terrible. Obviously, it's a decent book, but not great. Second to last in the month of August, we have The Story of Charlotte's Web. So I went into this book expecting basic biography of the author of Charlotte's Web. I liked it at first because I thought that the author's writing was very homey, welcoming, just nice and pleasant. And it stayed that way, but it started to rub on me because he got super flowery with his words. And also, he mentioned in the beginning that he would address E.B. White as Elwyn, the E in E.B. White, when he was a kid. And then when he shifted to talking about E.B. White when he was an adult, he would refer to him as Andy, which was the nickname that White picked up as an adult. And he forecast that at the beginning, so I knew it was coming, but it still felt really weird and almost like, who is this Andy person that I'm learning about, even though about 60% of the book, the author refers to him as Andy. So that felt weird, and I thought a way to avoid that could have been just to refer to him as White all the way through, you know, which a lot of biographies do. And then he skated over a lot of the chronology And there were big gaps here and big gaps there, and then minute details on the writing of Charlotte's Web. And I get that. This is, the subtitle is, well, the actual title is The Story of Charlotte's Web. It's not a biography of E.B. White, but it was a biography. So it was good, average, not terrible, but not too great either. And lastly, at the time of filming, I haven't quite finished it, but reading for only a couple hours, I'm over 150 pages into this. I was a little worried at the size that I wouldn't be able to get through it, but it reads very well. I think I will rate this one average by the time I get to the end of it, just because the big frustrating thing to me is this says it's a 1,000-year history, but about 150 pages into this 500-page book, and we've already talked about Catherine the Great. We're into 2 generations on, I forget the monarch's name, so it's already the early 1800s, and it's only 150 pages into the book. Like the whole section where the Mongols controlled the area now known as Russia, yeah, we don't get anything. The author doesn't talk about it at all. You start to get details with Ivan the Terrible. The historiography of this, I'm not as impressed with, but the writing style is very captivating and definitely will engage readers who, say, love the idea of the Romanovs and Anastasia and etc. So some final thoughts. Of the initial 22 books on my TBR for this month, I got to 20 of them, which I consider a rousing success. I wasn't sure with the start of the school year. I think I could have gotten to the other 2, but I got really bogged down with, and the show went on, and then 6 Day War, which I mentioned for both of them. The other ones read really quickly. Overall, this was an month. Most of the books I rated 3 stars, hence the I started off the month with some really terrible books. I finished the month with average ratings, but in there I did have 3 5-star books. The most recent that I finished was Push Out. And then I also had On My Own, which was Memoirs of Eleanor Roosevelt. And I can't remember the third one, even though I just looked at it. And coming up tomorrow on the channel, I'm going to have my TBR for September, which I'll talk a little bit more about then. But the 2 books that I didn't get to this month, I am going to carry over to next month, so I'll talk about them then. Thanks so much for watching. I can't wait to get into the books for next month.